Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine Podcast Radio. You're about to listen to an episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. Do you follow the pack or challenge the status quo? Join Ted as he explores how to succeed by going against conventional wisdom. You'll hear leaders in technology and security tell stories about how they achieve their success by doing things differently. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Tech Done Different. As always, I'm your host, Ted Harrington, and with me today is my special guest, Hywel Carver, the CEO of Skiller Whale. Hywel, thanks for joining the show, man.
Ted, it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, same. So I want to just dive right in. You and I were chatting the other day about all these interesting topics of training, and the one I wanted to start with, I've like 57 different questions here on my list to ask you because you're a fascinating guy. The first is, what is training? Like, what is training really? I mean, I think everybody knows what training is in their mind, right? Like, I go to a thing to learn a thing to acquire a skill. But like, how do we break down what the trainer is trying to achieve? And like, what does completed even mean when it comes to training?
That's a really hard question to answer because I think the answer is so different depending on who you ask. And I actually have a bit of a problem with the word training, because if you take a sentence like "I train you," the subject of that, the doer in the sentence, is I am the one doing something. And you, the person being trained, are just the object of that. You're having something done to you. And actually, I think that puts you in quite a passive position. And it means that I am the one actively doing something. You are having something done to you. And that's why I think the word, I kind of rub up against the word training in a bad way, honestly. So I think perspectives differ. If you think about training, what the word is telling you, it's training happens if I am telling you something. That is, training has happened because I have trained you. Whether or not you've learned it is kind of a separate question. Did you learn from me? In that case, you is the subject. You've done some learning from me, hopefully. If I'm training you, you've learned something from me. And so the end of training, the goal of it really depends on the mindset of the people who are putting it together. So ideally, in an ideal world, I think the aim of training is that you have learned something and you've got a new skill coming out of it. There's something new that you can do. Most training is really around skills rather than things like knowledge or wisdom. Those tend to be not what we use training for. We're interested in people who are able to do something new. And hopefully that means that you have learned that skill by training. But sometimes you'll find that the ends of training are actually about simply completion, that some set of things has been put before you and you've got to the end. It's a kind of endurance challenge. And sometimes you'll find that the aim is certification, which is like completion, but you get a certificate at the end, which typically has much less value than the skill itself. But we hope that if you come out with a certificate, or the people who've paid for the training maybe hope that if you've come out with a certificate, then you've also come out with a skill. I think that's the assumption that's there when you view that as the goal of training.
I like the way you framed this idea that training is, of course, about learning and is about acquisition of a skill. So is this true or false, that training must deliver a skill? Or is there a type of training that is about, and we can use a different word if you don't want to use training, is there a type of learning mode or whatever you would prefer we call it, where it's about maybe changing someone's mindset? Or is that a skill, right? Someone goes in thinking X and they leave. Now they know how to think Y. How should we think about that? Is that a skill?
I would think about that as a skill. So broadly, I think knowledge is data. It's information. If you know something, then that counts as knowledge. It's a fact almost that you could like write down or put on a Wikipedia page. And you can learn those things by repetition, by rote. all those kind of memorization techniques are really about gaining new knowledge. A skill is something that you can do, but it's hard to explain how you do it. So there is a skill, I don't know, I've got a glass of water in front of me. There is a skill I've had for a long time in my life of picking up a glass of water. I can't tell you exactly every action I'm doing to pick that glass of water up, but I've done it twice while speaking, and I barely had to think about it. If I had to teach you how to do that, I'd find it very difficult to explain exactly the motions I was going through. And then I would describe a kind of third layer of learning as wisdom, which is it's kind of knowledge that's instinctive. It's it's an instinct that you have that's hard to explain how you even got that, but you're really sure that you're really sure that something is a good idea. So I would say changing the way that you think is a skill, and it's a skill that's kind of invisible though, because it's a mental one rather than a kind of physical one in the real world. There's no kind of artifact that you can look at that shows that skill was there.
I love it. Yeah. And we're in a podcast right now talking about tech done different and thinking differently. So obviously that's part of where the question comes from, but selfishly also asking, because I'm putting together a course myself right now. And one of the big thrusts of the course is I want people to think differently. And I don't just want the course to be like, here's 10 things to do. Thing number 1, go do A, B, and C. Thing number 2, do D, E, and F. And you get those as well. But those aren't, in my mind, the most effective way to really drive change is to identify where the thinking is flawed and then give the skills. Do you think that that's an appropriate way to think, or am I overcomplicating it?
No, I don't think you're overcomplicating it. So there are two frameworks I reach for when thinking about skills, and apologies if this gets a bit too into the weeds and I geek out too much on this stuff. So one is Bloom's taxonomy. It's this kind of hierarchy of learning, and it describes the levels of outcomes of learning. There are 6 levels. It starts at things like knowledge, which is data. You know that the capital of Peru is Lima or whatever. There's a layer above that, which is comprehension. It's like understanding something new. Then there are levels for application, analysis, synthesis, and then finally evaluation. There are variants on this where synthesis and evaluation are swapped, but essentially at the top of that pyramid is the ability to do something new and to really not just know something, but to use it. Essentially, it's skill. And so most of the work that my company does, Skill the World, that you mentioned at the beginning, is all about focusing on skills and having those kinds of outcomes. Separately, there's a framework called ICAP, and ICAP describes the kinds of experiences people can go through to learn, essentially kinds of training, which run from interactive as being the best. So that's doing something, but also discussing it with other humans, through to constructive, which means doing something and doing something to use the skill that you're trying to gain, through to active, the A in ICAP, which means maybe thinking through something, but maybe not actually doing the thing, through to finally passive. And passive is reading a book, watching a video, sitting through a talk, those kinds of things. And essentially, if you want to get to the top of the pyramid of learning, to get to that kind of synthesis and evaluation stage of having an ability, then you also need to go to the top of the kind of the pyramid of ways of learning, which means doing things that are constructive and interactive. And so if what you want is for people to gain a skill and to be able to actually use it, then you need to make sure that they're doing something with that skill, not just considering it, but actively applying it, and ideally applying it with other humans. One of the things that's unique about skills is that we gain them best through trial and error. So, and this is a real difference between sort of knowledge learning and skill learning. So knowledge is like data, like I said before. Here's a line from a play: to be or not to be, that is the question. If you say that 20 times, you'll learn it, you'll remember it tomorrow. You'll wonder why I brought it up, but you'll remember it tomorrow. It doesn't make you any better as an actor, though. You're not suddenly going to be, Kenneth Branagh playing Hamlet just because you memorized that line. To get better as an actor, you need to improve at that skill, which means delivering the line and then having someone say, actually, that time you did this bit not so well, try it again this way, and giving that kind of closing that feedback loop, that trial and error, so that you can try and improve.
Is there a distinction between these? You've given some really good ideas for how to acquire, skills and knowledge, and all the distinctions that you've drawn are really powerful. But is there a distinction between someone at different levels in an organization? Like, does an executive go through this process differently than, say, the newest intern, and then of course everyone in between?
I don't think so. So ultimately, the things that you're building on might be different, and the skills that you want to acquire might be different. So the skills that we can assume you already have and the knowledge you already have might be different. The skills and knowledge that you're trying to acquire might be different. But essentially, these things are fundamentally the same. You're trying to acquire a skill, whether that's, I don't know, negotiating an international merger of your company, or it's working out how to, I don't know, make a really great cup of coffee, because that's your job as an intern. Ultimately, it's the same principles. The same principles apply. And actually, if I can go on a tangent about training, this is one of my bugbears about the world of training. So one of the things that we talked about before was about how we had kind of reimagined how training works. And one of the key parts of that is really personalizing and targeting what training that you do. The typical way that gets done is you take some kind of quiz and you answer a load of questions, and you do this on one of those like video learning websites, and you answer a load of questions, and at the end of the quiz it goes bleep bloop, we've discovered that you are an intermediate Python developer. Now you need to sit through these 34 videos, each is an hour and a half long, for intermediate Python developers. And we call that personalization. And actually, the things that people need to know are much more granular and detailed than that. And frankly, it always seems to me, laziness to think that if I can just tell that you're this good at Python, therefore this is the massive bucket of things that you need to learn. And so to come back to your original question, that question of the kind of intern versus someone in the middle of their career versus the executive, ultimately, it's not about your level, it's about what you can do. It's about your capabilities right now. If you're an executive who doesn't know how to make a good cup of coffee, that's a skill that you can learn, and you'll learn it in the same way as the intern who doesn't know how to make a good cup of coffee.
Interesting. Which also, of course, begets the question, at different stages in your career, do you need to acquire certain skills? I mean, we're obviously talking about in extremes right now. The CEO probably doesn't need to spend time learning how to make a good cup of coffee, but maybe there are things where, hopefully not even, but maybe the CEO finds himself or herself in a situation where the CEO doesn't know how to maybe manage a project. And so then the question is, okay, well, should the CEO acquire that skill? Should the CEO hire around it? So how should we think about everything we're talking about today is, of course, improving things, right? So taking a certain level of proficiency and increasing it. And that might mean not just proficiency, but like deficiency. You're bad at something and we're going to make you now not bad at it. How should we think about the distinction between someone who is trying to level up a skill to a higher level of skill versus someone who's taking a weakness and trying to just neutralize the weakness into something that is no longer bad? They might not ever be the best at it, but they don't stink at it anymore. How should we think about those differently, or should we?
So to me, well, that's a really good question, actually, at the end. Should we? And I'm not sure that we should. So I think the difference there is only really the required level of skill, right? There was one thing, the first example you talked about was someone who's good at something and getting better. And the second example was someone who's not good at something and wants to fix a deficiency. And actually, those two people might be at the same level of skill currently, and they might go to the same level of skill after they've improved. The only thing that's different there is the level of skill that was required. If your current skill level is below the required level of skill, it feels like a deficiency. But actually, the path to improving at that skill is probably the same regardless of the requirement. Now how you manage that is going to be more of a kind of contextual, strategic decision. If it's not worth your time to learn how to, if you can't make a great cup of coffee, to take my daft example, and you are a high-powered CEO, it's probably worth you hiring someone who can make your coffee, among other things.
Yeah, definitely higher weaknesses around you. And I see it happen a lot actually. And I'm not a leadership coach or anything, but I do see other leaders sometimes struggle within their teams where they might look at a member of the team who is not very good at something. And they're like, that's annoying that that person is not good at that thing. And so let's invest some time, effort, and money in training them so they become better than not good at that thing. I'm of the belief that you should invest your time, effort, and money in taking someone who's already good at something and increase that skill because you'll have exponential results. Whereas eliminating a deficiency, at best, you make them adequate. Do you agree or disagree with that line of thinking? Like, am I oversimplifying it?
I think they achieve different things. So you're right that taking someone who's great and making them excellent will have some big benefits. But you can also get more capacity, more throughput in your team if you take someone who's weak and teach them something new. So this was actually something that I saw a lot when I was doing consulting. Was I would see a lot of teams where the gap between where the team was and the team really excelling felt very small, but kind of hard to cross. And that this was actually a big inspiration for my company. I would see teams of Python machine learning engineers who were trying all these things, but were not very good at writing production quality Python. And so they had one person on the team whose job was to productionize everything. And the rest of the team was just furiously throwing stuff at this guy to get ready for production. He was the most stressed person I think I've ever been working close to. And it just felt like there was such a short distance those people needed to improve to get them to write much better quality Python, to take some of the load off him. And that's a situation that wouldn't be helped by him getting even better at writing Python. He was already excellent anyway. What that situation needed was a way for me to take those people and improve their existing Python skills, which were kind of deficient for where they could have been.
So the idea of the acquisition of these skills and knowledge base that we're talking about, and obviously all the different ways that we're thinking about how we approach it's really, really fascinating. And one of the things that you actually brought up earlier in a conversation that you and I had a few months ago was this idea of best practices. And you and I both sort of like roll our eyes at that term, like, oh, best practices. So let's just dig into this idea of best practices. So you reject the idea of, and I'm putting this in air quotes, air quote, best practices. What does that mean to you, and why do you hate that term? I know I hate it, but why do you hate it?
I hate that term because if there was a single right answer, you'd already know it. You would already know it. If there was a single thing that was the answer to that tough question, you wouldn't need to go and ask someone what a best practice is. And that's what I think is behind the thinking, behind what people are saying when they want a best practice. Is like, give me a shortcut to the answer. And actually, I think almost all of those kinds of questions where people talk about best practices are highly contextual, to the point where we've actually started a podcast called Primarily Context Based, to take questions like that, where people think there might be a single right answer, and talk about why that is exactly not the case and how you should be examining your context to find the right answer. There's this I've heard the same idea expressed in multiple ways. So I believe it comes from the martial art Aikido, that you have Shu, Ha, and Ri levels of mastery. Shu is like you're doing what the sensei, what the teacher tells you to do. Ha is like you're able to follow the teacher and kind of you can be the teacher almost. And then Ri is when you've left that behind and you're kind of forging your own path and you've kind of become beyond a teacher. You're really a master. At the same time, I was on a jazz improvisation course, and a trumpeter called Pat Harvison expressed it as imitate, assimilate, innovate, which I think is exactly the same three stages of mastery, but expressed in a way that's maybe a bit easier for native English speakers to understand. And I think there are lots of areas of life where I've gained skills and I can tell that I've gone through this process of imitating things and then assimilating the skill and then being able to innovate on it. And when people talk about best practices, what it tells you is that they're at the imitate stage of that, and they don't realize that there are stages beyond that. And so what they're asking for is, give me a pattern, give me a kind of a template that I can copy, and I'll just do that. And actually, what I want to do when people ask for a best practice is to say, there's this whole world out there. We can give you 5 best practices now, and you can choose one, and then you're going to get good at it, and it's going to become kind of second nature to you. And then you're going to start forging your own path. You're going to make the kind of execution of this, the solving of this problem, your own.
So is imitate in this 3-phase process as you're describing, is imitate a good thing or a bad thing? And maybe let me put some context around that question, because the word imitate, I think, usually has a negative connotation to it, right? It's like you're not being authentic, you're kind of following what someone else does or whatever. But in terms of acquisition of skill and knowledge, imitate is in my mind, it seems like a great way to start. I think a great example is where things like, maybe someone's new to investing in the stock market, and the advice is, do you see what Warren Buffett does? Just like follow his 3 things and just do that. So you're like imitating. You're not Warren Buffett. You're not inventing the thing. So that's a form of imitation. That's a good thing. So in your mind, is it good or is it bad? Imitate.
I think it's good. I don't think you get to mastery without having first imitated, but I think you need to, well, you probably want to accelerate through that imitation as fast as possible, and start kind of let the skill become natural to you, and then start innovating around it. I think there are areas where imitation is bad. Copying someone's IP is not they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. That is definitely not the case if you're just, stealing someone's, creations. But I think when you're acquiring a skill, you don't get to mastery without having first gone through being a beginner. It's just that if you're asking for a best practice, then you're almost not even aware that mastery is possible. You're asking for an answer to a question that doesn't have an answer.
So now what about the person who has achieved mastery in something, and as a result, there's a lot of confidence, they are succeeding and they feel on top of the world, and they want to now go do something else? Or maybe they don't even want to do something else. They just want to learn some maybe new business or enter a new market, or there's something where they're no longer the master. Does the person who's already achieved mastery once go about starting over differently, or is it the same? And do they go through the same steps? Like, for example, when Michael Jordan retired from basketball to try baseball, did he go straight to imitation, or was he more farther along in the process? How does that work? Someone's already achieved mastery, they're starting something new. What does that process look like?
I think you can learn to learn. So I think you go to the same point. But if you're a good learner, if you've been through that cycle of getting to mastery multiple times, you'll find it easier to get there in something else. And it's one of the things that I really value most actually in people I hire, is people who are really self-aware of what they don't know, because those are people I've found to be very good at learning new things, because they know what to look for. They kind of structure new things that they're learning in their minds in a way that means they can spot their own gaps and go and fill them themselves. And so people who are good at doing that, I think, are very good at forming new mental models, which means that when they are going through that skill process and learning something and trying to get to mastery again, they're that much faster than the person who has done it less. It's like a muscle, almost like the kind of skill acquisition muscle is stronger in those people.
Yeah, that's really fast. Yeah, it's like a muscle. I like that framing. And also,
and
they've been through it once.
Relates back to your Michael Jordan example, right? I imagine
full circle.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, and then also you probably, because you've been through it once, or more than once, you can identify sort of the pitfalls or sensations along the way of like, oh, here's how something feels after 100 hours of doing something, and here's how it feels after 1,000 hours, and mean, not those exact milestones, but you kind of know how things feel differently, right? I mean, it seems like that would be the progress.
You recognize those aha moments. You recognize those kind of turning points where something kind of clicks for you, and then you're like, now I'm at this level. This feels like when I was, I don't know, here before learning that other thing.
Some people who achieve mastery might feel that they have actually not mastered it yet. So how do you, like, I think about things where maybe, like, okay, so I wrote a book. And so some people might be like, oh, if you wrote a book, you've mastered those ideas. And I feel like, maybe there's elements maybe I've mastered, but I'm like the student as a result of writing the book. I feel like the book helped me learn more. So in your experience, do you feel that that people actually recognize if they've achieved mastery? And so I guess that's one part of the question. The second part of the question is whether they recognize it or not. Once you achieve mastery, is there like super secret mastery that comes next? Or are you just like, you hit a ceiling and you can no longer improve?
I think one of the best ways to really learn something and to master it is to teach it to other people. So I've written 2 books. They were both for children. Well, one was for children and one was for adults who find maths really difficult. And so in terms of level, they were like not a million miles apart. And so that's kind of different to writing books for adults who are kind of at the cutting edge of a skill. But you learn a lot from teaching and from, I mean, even if I'm learning something in my spare time, I often find myself imagining relaying it while I'm learning it, because that helps me to kind of, again, to structure it and to get it all clear in my head. I think the more you know about something, the more you realize you don't know. I think there's a kind of deceleration as you get closer to a point of absolute mastery. You realize that you'll never actually hit it, like how no object can ever reach the speed of light. The closer you get to the speed of light, the more energy you have to get put in to accelerate. I think it's like that. I think when you're in the top 1%, you realize how far away you are from being in the top 0.1% of that thing, and you realize that actually maybe you'll never get there, and this is enough mastery for now. So I guess there is always super mastery. There is always more developed you can get with your skill, and better until you're the world champion at that thing. Or like most of us, you get to a point and you say, I'm not going to be world champion. I'm perfectly happy where I am. I'm going to go and do this other thing now.
Yeah, that's super fascinating the way you describe that. And I can't remember who told me this, but I somewhere along the way I met some real estate agent who sells homes in a very, very affluent area. And so it's, selling like multi-million-dollar homes. So most of the people that they're selling to have succeeded financially. And this person made this really interesting observation that was that this person who has, by every objective measure, the buyers who by every objective measure have succeeded financially, they don't consider themselves rich, because they look at the person who's buying the like $10 million home and they're like, that's the person who's rich. And, it seems like maybe that's where everybody is in their own learning journey. They see the step one step above them and they're like, that's better than I am. I got to get there. Would you agree with that?
I think everyone is aware of that step beyond them. I think, the better you get at the thing, the better you get at a skill, the more you get into the world of that skill, and the more you realize the people out there who are just better than you, who are better than you, who you weren't even aware of before. But as you've got better, you've realized that there are people who are just further beyond you. So when I was young, I played the saxophone, and I still do. And there was a time when I wanted to be a professional musician. And the older I got and the kind of better bands I was in, and the more I was mixing with people who were brilliant musicians, the more I realized I just didn't have the same level of passion as they did. I really like it an awful lot. I find it super fun. It's amazing in many, many ways. But I don't have the commitment of the people who are professionals and who are incredibly good at it. And so picking the point where you want to get off on the given skill, I think is is a very helpful skill to have in itself for a happy life, because you can't be the world's best at probably more than one or two things. And actually, a lot of us would rather be nowhere near the world's best in 20 things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even being the world's best in one thing, that's like a total dedication of your whole soul to make that happen.
Right. Exactly. It's night and day, isn't it?
Well, you're dropping this nugget on us that you got the saxophone. I mean, we would have started with that had I known. We would have just, you'd played an opening set. We would have rolled right into it, and then we would have had a little discussion about how to level up. The whole story was ready to go.
For what it's worth, my son is asleep downstairs. It's 10:10 when we're recording this, so I probably I'd have had to say no anyway. But maybe another time I'll serenade you, Ted.
There you go. I like it. Well, Hywel, you're great, man. The insights have been so fantastic today. As we wrap up, what parting wisdom do you want to leave with our audience here today?
I think if I had one bit of wisdom to impart, it's to try not to think in terms of levels. I think levels are generally unhelpful, and they are an artificial way of putting a label on a box that is actually a lot more rich and complicated and fine-grained than a label can do. So we do this all the time in tech teams. We say this person is junior, intermediate, senior. This is their role. They work on this bit of the product. And actually, people have this rich set of skills, of capabilities. And if you're interested in improving those, the level doesn't help you. The level is useful for setting someone's salary, maybe, but it's not helpful in terms of working out what people are already capable of and what they need to be capable of to make themselves happy, to be a saxophone professional, to be I don't know, what the company needs, what the business needs to kind of achieve its goals. We actually have a whole part of our website about this. It's an approach called targeted capability training. I really recommend you check it out, because it's how we work internally, and it's just a really sensible and surprisingly unique way of taking capabilities and extending them in a way that means that people genuinely have new valuable skills. And it's an approach that genuinely works in business, but also in terms of improving your saxophone playing.
I love it. What a good note to end on. So Hywel Carver, thanks so much for sharing so much wisdom today.
Cool. Cheers, Ted. Good to speak to you.
And for everybody else, you want to learn more about Hywel or other guests, or you want to request to appear as a guest yourself, just head to tedharrington.com/podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.